The judge stared down from the bench and said coldly, "You will stand when addressing this court, or you'll be held in contempt." The room went still. Then, slowly, and with visible pain, a disabled royal guard rose to his feet, one hand gripping his cane, the other trembling from the strain. What he said next moved the entire courtroom to tears. So what were the words that silenced a judge and brought even the toughest court officers to weep? Before we reveal that powerful moment, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The gavel echoed through courtroom 7 like a gunshot, its sharp crack silencing the murmur of spectators packed into every available seat. Judge Marcus Pryor, a man whose reputation for rigid adherence to protocol had earned him both respect and fear in equal measure, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and surveyed the scene before him with the cold efficiency of someone who had presided over thousands of cases. His courtroom was his kingdom, and in his kingdom, rules were sacred. Seated in the witness box was Sergeant Nathaniel Dre, 34 years old, his Royal Guard uniform pressed to perfection, despite the circumstances that had brought him here. The red tunic with its distinctive brass buttons caught the fluorescent light, each medal on his chest telling a story of service that most would never fully comprehend. But it was what couldn't be seen that had drawn the attention of every person. In that room, the wheelchair that had become as much a part of him as the uniform he wore with unwavering pride. The case itself seemed almost mundane by comparison. Marcus Whitley, a career criminal with hollow eyes and shaking hands, sat in the defendant's dock charged with armed robbery. 3 weeks earlier, he had cornered Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, 73 years old, outside a Tesco in Westminster, demanding her handbag with a kitchen knife pressed against her ribs. It should have been straightforward victim testimony, CCTV footage, swift conviction. But nothing about this case would prove to be straightforward. Judge Pryor leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Sergeant Dre, this court requires all witnesses to stand when addressing the bench. You will rise, or be held in contempt of court." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of tradition and the inflexibility that had defined Pryor's 20-year career on the bench. The prosecutor, James Hartwell, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had warned the judge about Sergeant Dre's condition, had suggested accommodations, but Pryor had dismissed such concerns with a wave of his hand. "The law is the law, Mr. Hartwell. We do not make exceptions for convenience." In the gallery, retired Colonel William Hayes watched the proceedings with growing unease. He had served alongside Dre's father in the Falklands, had watched young Nathaniel grow from a boy obsessed with toy soldiers into a man who embodied everything the Royal Guard represented. The colonel's weathered hands gripped his walking stick tighter as he witnessed what was about to unfold. Sergeant Dre's response came quietly, but it carried the weight of artillery. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I can't stand, but I'll be damned if that means I haven't stood for something." His voice was steady, controlled, but underneath lay the steel that had been forged through years of service and tempered by months of unimaginable pain. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Judge Pryor's face flushed red, his knuckles white as he gripped his gavel. In 3 decades of legal practice, no one had ever spoken to him with such quiet defiance. "Sergeant, your medical condition does not excuse you from showing proper respect to this court. I will ask you once more, Judge Pryor." Dre's interruption sent a ripple of shock through the gallery. "May I tell this court exactly why I cannot stand?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Pryor's mouth opened, then closed. Protocol dictated one response, but something in Dre's eyes, a depth of pain that transcended the physical, gave him pause. "Very well, Sergeant, but I warn you, this court will not be swayed by emotional appeals." Dre nodded slowly, his gaze moving across the faces of the jury, the spectators, finally settling on Marcus Whitley, who had been smirking since the proceedings began. 6 months ago, I wasn't in this chair. I was walking my patrol route near Buckingham Palace, same as I had every day for 8 years. The tourists were out in force that morning, families with children, couples taking selfies, the usual crowd that gathers to watch the changing of the guard. His voice took on a distant quality, as if he was seeing that day play out again behind his eyes. "I was checking the perimeter when I heard screaming from the direction of St. James's Park. Not the excited screaming of children at play, but terror, pure, animalistic terror." Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, seated in the front row, leaned forward, She had insisted on attending every day of the trial. Her handbag, the same one Whitley had tried to steal, clutched protectively in her lap. I ran toward the sound. Dre continued, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. A man, strung out on something that made his eyes look like black holes, had cornered a group of schoolchildren from St. Margaret's Primary, 7-year-olds on a field trip to see where the Queen lived. He had a knife, not unlike the one Mr. Whitley used on Mrs. Thorne, and he was screaming about voices, about messages only he could hear. The prosecutor wanted to object, to point out the irrelevance to the current case, but something in the atmosphere of the courtroom stopped him. Even Judge Pryor, notorious for cutting off tangential testimony, remained silent. The children's teacher, Miss Sarah Phillips, was trying to keep herself between this man and her students, but she was barely 5 feet tall and terrified out of her mind. The man kept advancing, the knife shaking in his hand, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I hesitated for even 1 second, those children were going to die. Dre's hands, which had remained perfectly still throughout his testimony, now moved to his left thigh. I didn't think about protocol. I didn't think about proper procedure, or backup, or any of the things they drill into you at Sandhurst. I just ran. His voice cracked almost imperceptibly. I tackled him from behind, tried to get the knife away from him, but he was stronger than he looked. Desperation and whatever chemicals were flooding his system made him fight like a wild animal. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys. The knife went in here. Dre rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a scar that ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow. And here, he indicated his shoulder, and here, his hand moved to his side. But the worst one, the one that changed everything, was when he drove it into my lower back as I was trying to pin him down. Judge Pryor found himself leaning forward, his earlier irritation replaced by something he rarely allowed himself to feel in his courtroom, genuine human concern. I felt the blade hit my spine. Dre's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the perfect silence, every word was clear. There was this moment, just a split second, where everything went quiet. No screaming, no fighting, nothing. And then pain unlike anything I had ever imagined was possible. But do you know what I was thinking about in that moment? The question hung in the air, rhetorical but demanding an answer nonetheless. I was thinking about my father, Staff Sergeant William Dre, killed in action in Afghanistan when I was 16. He used to tell me that the measure of a man isn't whether he falls down, it's whether he gets back up. But lying there on the pavement, feeling the warmth spreading down my legs before I realized it was my own blood, I understood for the first time that sometimes getting back up isn't about standing on your own 2 feet. Marcus Whitley had stopped smirking. His court-appointed attorney was staring at Dre with an expression somewhere between awe and horror. In the gallery, Colonel Hayes felt tears he hadn't shed since his wife's funeral threatening to spill over. The paramedics arrived within 4 minutes. 4 minutes might not sound like long, but when you're lying paralyzed on concrete, watching your blood pool around 7 terrified children, it feels like eternity. They kept asking me questions: my name, the date, whether I could feel my legs. I kept asking about the children. Were they hurt? Were they safe? Did anyone check on Miss Phillips? Dr. Amanda Chen had been working in the emergency department at St. Mary's Hospital for 12 years, but she still remembered the day Sergeant Dre was wheeled through her doors. "I've seen a lot of trauma," she would later tell reporters, "but I've never seen someone more concerned about other people's well-being than their own catastrophic injuries." He was asking about the children before we even had him stabilized. Dre continued his testimony, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "The surgery took 14 hours. When I woke up, my commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, was sitting beside my bed. The first thing he told me was that all the children were safe. The second thing was that I would never walk again." He paused, letting that sink in. "The third thing he told me was that the man with the knife, his name was David Brennan, had a history of mental illness. He'd been in and out of treatment facilities for years. On the day he attacked those children, he had been off his medication for 3 weeks because he couldn't afford it." Judge Pryor shifted uncomfortably. This was veering into territory preferred to avoid the systemic failures that created the criminals who appeared in his courtroom. "I spent 3 months in rehabilitation, learning how to do everything I had taken for granted my entire life. How to transfer from bed to wheelchair. How to navigate curbs and stairs and doors that suddenly seemed designed to keep me out. To put on my uniform, this uniform with hands that had to compensate for everything my legs could no longer do. The jury was transfixed. Several members were openly crying, but Dre seemed oblivious to their tears, lost in the memory of those dark months. But the hardest part wasn't learning to live in a wheelchair. It was the letter that arrived on my third day of physical therapy. From his jacket pocket, Dre produced an envelope, worn soft from countless readings. It was from the children. All 7 of them had signed it, along with Miss Phillips and several parents. "Would you like to know what they wrote, Your Honor?" Judge Pryor nodded, not trusting his voice. "Thank you, Mr. Soldier, for keeping us safe. We drew pictures of you as a superhero because that's what you are. Love, Class to B." Dre's voice finally broke. 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez drew a picture of me in my red uniform with a cape, standing in front of them with my arms spread wide. Standing, Your Honor. Even though she had seen me fall, even though she knew I was hurt, in her mind I was still standing. The impact of those words rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. In the jury box, retired teacher Margaret Holmes was sobbing openly, her hand pressed to her mouth. She had taught primary school for 40 years and had nightmares about scenarios exactly like the one Dre had faced. "The doctors told me that my career in the Royal Guard was over," Dre continued, his composure gradually returning. "They said I should consider myself lucky to be alive, that I should think about disability benefits and early retirement. But they didn't understand something fundamental about what it means to serve." He straightened in his wheelchair, his posture becoming more rigid, more military. "The Royal Guard doesn't exist because we can march in formation or look impressive for tourists. We exist to protect, to serve, to stand metaphorically and literally between harm and those who cannot protect themselves." The day I put this uniform back on for the first time after my injury, I understood that I had never been more qualified to wear it. Judge Pryor found himself studying Dre with new eyes. The medals on his chest suddenly seemed to carry more weight. Military Cross, the Distinguished Service Order, ribbons representing deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, and most recently, the George Cross, awarded for acts of conspicuous bravery in circumstances of extreme danger. "Which brings us to why I'm here today," Dre said, his gaze finally settling on Marcus Whitley. 3 weeks ago, I was on duty outside Westminster Abbey when I witnessed Mr. Whitley approach Mrs. Thorne. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the fear in her eyes, could recognize the body language of a predator stalking prey. Mrs. Thorne nodded vigorously, her knuckles white, as she gripped her handbag. I called for backup and began moving toward them, but my wheelchair can only move so fast, especially on cobblestones. By the time I reached them, Mr. Whitley had Mrs. Thorne pressed against a wall, demanding her belongings. She was crying, begging him not to hurt her, offering him everything she had. The prosecutor, James Hartwell, had been preparing for this testimony for weeks, but hearing it delivered with such quiet intensity still sent chills down his spine. When Mr. Whitley saw me approaching, he laughed. Actually laughed. He said, and I quote, "What's the cripple in the fancy costume going to do? Call his mummy?" Dre's jaw tightened. I explained that I was a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard, that he was under arrest, and that he needed to step away from Mrs. Thorne immediately. The memory of that confrontation played out behind Dre's eyes like a film reel. Mr. Whitley's response was to press the knife closer to Mrs. Thorne's throat. He told me that if I came any closer, he would gut the old woman like a fish. Those were his exact words, Your Honor. In the defendant's dock, Marcus Whitley had gone pale. His attorney was furiously scribbling notes, but they both knew that the CCTV footage from Westminster Abbey's security cameras had captured every moment of the encounter. I'd been trained in crisis negotiation, de-escalation techniques, all the protocols for situations involving hostages, but there's something they don't teach you in training manuals: how to maintain authority when the criminal sees you as less than human because of your disability. Judge Pryor winced at the bluntness of the statement. I tried reasoning with him. I explained that Mrs. Thorne was someone's grandmother, that she had done nothing to deserve his threats. I offered myself as a hostage instead, told him I was worth more as a member of the Royal Guard than an elderly pensioner could ever be. His response was to spit in my face. The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening. That's when Mrs. Thorne did something extraordinary. Dre's voice softened with admiration. She looked Mr. Whitley straight in the eye and said, "Young man, that soldier has already given more for this country than you'll ever understand. If you're going to hurt someone, hurt me and leave him alone." Eleanor Thorne straightened in her seat, her chin raised with the same defiance she had shown that day. Mr. Whitley's response was to backhand her across the face so hard that she fell to the ground. "And that, Your Honor, is when I stopped being a negotiator and returned to being a soldier." The transformation in Dre's voice was subtle but unmistakable. The measured tones of testimony gave way to something harder, more dangerous. "I rammed my wheelchair directly into Mr. Whitley's legs, using the momentum and the chair's weight to knock him off balance. As he fell backward, I grabbed his wrist, one holding the knife, and applied a joint lock I learned in close combat training. The knife clattered away across the cobblestones, and Mr. Whitley found himself face down on the pavement with a cripple in a fancy costume, applying pressure to nerve points that would have made him scream if he'd had any breath left. Several jurors were nodding approvingly. In the gallery, Colonel Hayes was grinning with fierce pride. Backup arrived 2 minutes later. Mr. Whitley was taken into custody without further incident. Mrs. Thorne was treated for minor injuries and released, and I filed my report, expecting this to be just another case in just another day of service. Dre paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling back on Judge Pryor. "But here we are, Your Honor, and you're telling me I need to stand to show respect to this court. I need to stand to give testimony about protecting an innocent woman from a career criminal who thought my disability made me weak. I need to stand to demonstrate the respect I have for the law and the justice system I've sworn to protect." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable now, and Judge Pryor felt the weight of 300 eyes upon him. "So let me ask you something, Your Honor. When I tackled that knife-wielding maniac to protect 7 children, was I standing? When I spent 14 hours in surgery to save my life, was I standing? When I learned to live with paralysis so I could continue serving my country, was I standing? When I put my life on the line 3 weeks ago to protect Mrs. Thorne, was I standing?" Each question hit like a physical blow. Judge Pryor found himself gripping his gavel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Because, if your definition of standing requires the use of working legs, then I suppose I wasn't. But if your definition of standing means facing danger without flinching, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and serving something greater than yourself regardless of personal cost, then Your Honor, I haven't stopped standing since the day I put on this uniform." The silence that followed was absolute. In the jury box, former police officer David Martinez was crying openly. In the gallery, a woman who had lost her son in Afghanistan stood up, tears streaming down her face. Then another person stood, and another. Marcus Whitley looked around in confusion as the entire courtroom rose to their feet, everyone except the man who had inspired them to stand. Judge Pryor stared at the scene before him, his throat tight with emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. In 30 years on the bench, he had never seen anything like this. The majesty of law had always been about precedent, procedure, the cold application of justice without sentiment. But sitting before him was a man who embodied justice in its purest form, not the mechanical process of legal proceedings, but the moral imperative to protect the innocent and serve the greater good. "Sergeant Dre." Judge Pryor's voice was hoarse with emotion. "This court recognizes that some forms of standing transcend the merely physical." The judge's words hung in the air like incense, sacred and transformative. In the defendant's dock, Marcus Whitley had buried his face in his hands, whether from shame or calculation was impossible to tell. His attorney, public defender Sarah Morrison, was staring at her client with something approaching disgust. "Your Honor," Dre said quietly, "I have one more thing to show the court, with your permission." Judge Pryor nodded, beyond caring about procedural niceties at this point. From another pocket, Dre produced a photograph, worn at the edges from handling. He passed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge's bench. Pryor's hands shook as he held it up to the light. The photograph showed 7 children in school uniforms, their arms wrapped around a man in Royal Guard regalia. The man was standing tall, proud, unmarked by the scars that would come to define his later life. At the bottom of the photo, in careful childish handwriting, was inscribed, "Our hero, Mr. Soldier Dre, thank you for keeping us safe. We love you." That picture was taken 3 days before the attack, Dre explained. The children from St. Margaret's Primary had won a contest to meet a real Royal Guard. I spent 2 hours with them that day. answering their questions, letting them try on my bearskin hat, teaching them about honor and service and what it means to protect others. Judge Pryor found himself studying each small face in the photograph, trying to imagine the terror they must have felt, the confusion of seeing their hero fall. After my injury, those same children started a letter-writing campaign. Every week, for 6 months, I received cards and drawings and messages of support. They raised money for my medical expenses by having bake sales and car washes. 7-year-olds, Your Honor, working to help a soldier they barely knew, because they understood something that many adults seem to forget. Dre's voice grew stronger, more resonant. They understood that heroes don't become heroes because nothing bad ever happens to them. Heroes become heroes because when bad things happen, they stand up anyway. They stand up for others. They stand up for what's right. They stand up even when, especially when standing up costs them everything. In the gallery, Miss Sarah Phillips was sobbing. She had requested leave from St. Margaret's Primary specifically to attend this trial, to support the man who had saved her students at such tremendous cost to himself. Emma Rodriguez, the little girl who drew me as a superhero, sent me another drawing last month. Would you like to see it, Your Honor? Before Judge Pryor could respond, Dre produced a second piece of paper, this one clearly recent. The drawing showed a figure in a red uniform sitting in a wheelchair. But instead of looking diminished, the figure seemed to radiate power. Around him stood other figures, children, adults, all looking up at him with expressions of admiration and love. Emma wrote on the back, "Mr. Soldier Dre, you're still our superhero. Wheels or legs doesn't matter. What matters is your heart." She's 8 years old now, Your Honor, and she understands something about heroism that apparently escaped some adults. Judge Pryor's hands were trembling as he examined the drawing. In his 3 decades on the bench, he had seen humanity at its worst. The criminals, the victims, the endless parade of broken lives and shattered dreams that comprised the criminal justice system. But he had rarely seen it at its best, and never with such clarity, such simple, profound truth. The law is about standing up for what's right, Dre continued, his voice growing more passionate. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves, about ensuring that justice prevails over chaos, that good triumphs over evil. Every day I put on this uniform, I stand up for those principles. Every time I roll out on patrol, I stand up for the values this country was built on. When I faced down Mr. Whitley 3 weeks ago, I stood up for Mrs. Thorne and for every other innocent person who might cross his path. Marcus Whitley's attorney leaned over to whisper something in her client's ear, but Whitley shook his head violently, his eyes fixed on Dre with an expression of growing recognition. "Your Honor, you can demand that I rise from this chair, but you cannot make me stand any taller than I already do. You can hold me in contempt for failing to follow your procedures, but you cannot make me feel contempt for the principles that put me in this chair in the first place. You can question my respect for this court, but you cannot question my respect for justice." The words hit Judge Pryor like physical blows. In his mind, he could see the arc of his own career, the thousands of defendants he had sentenced, the rigid adherence to protocol he had always prized, the cold efficiency with which he had dispensed justice without ever truly understanding what justice meant. "I have given everything I have to give in service of this country and its people," Dre said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtroom. "I have given my mobility, my independence, my dreams of the future I thought I would have, but I have never given my dignity, and I never will. Not to a criminal with a knife, not to a system that values procedure over principle, and not to anyone who mistakes accommodation for weakness." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Pryor stared down at Sergeant Dre, seeing him clearly for the first time not as a disabled man requiring special consideration, but as the embodiment of everything the law was supposed to protect and serve. The uniform, the medals, the wheelchair, they were all symbols of sacrifice made real, of principles lived rather than merely recited. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Pryor rose from his bench. Then, in a gesture that would be remembered long after his retirement, he stepped down from his elevated position and walked to where Dre sat. Without a word, he extended his hand. Dre clasped it firmly, their eyes meeting in a moment of perfect understanding. "Sergeant Dre," Judge Pryor's voice was thick with emotion, "this court stands corrected. You have shown more respect for justice in the last hour than I have seen in 30 years on this bench. Your testimony is accepted, and your service to this nation is acknowledged with the deepest gratitude." From the defendant's dock came an unexpected sound. Marcus Whitley was crying. Not the manipulative tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the deep, body-racking sobs of a man confronting the enormity of his own moral failure. "Your Honor," Whitley's voice was barely audible, "I want to change my plea." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Sarah Morrison tried to silence her client, but Whitley pushed her away. "I want to plead guilty," he said, louder now, "to all charges. I don't want a trial. I don't deserve one." Judge Pryor looked between Whitley and Dre, understanding that something profound had just occurred. "Mr. Whitley, you have a right to counsel, a right to a fair trial." "I waive my rights," Whitley said firmly. "I waive everything. I'm guilty, Your Honor. Guilty of robbery, guilty of assault, guilty of being the kind of person who would threaten a grandmother and mock a war hero. I'm guilty, and I want to pay for what I've done." 3 hours later, the courtroom had emptied except for a small group gathered around Sergeant Dre. Mrs. Eleanor Thorne sat beside him, her weathered hand resting on his arm. Colonel Hayes stood at attention nearby, his chest swelled with pride. For the young man he had watched grow into an extraordinary soldier. Judge Pryor approached the group slowly, his judicial robes replaced by a simple suit, his authority transformed into humility. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I've spent so many years focused on the letter of the law that I forgot about its spirit. You reminded me today why I became a judge in the first place." Dre looked up at him with compassion rather than anger. "Your Honor, we all lose sight of what's important sometimes. What matters is that we find our way back." Outside the courthouse, the media waited in force. News of what had happened in Courtroom 7 had already begun to spread, and reporters from across the nation were eager to interview the Royal Guard who had redefined what it meant to stand for justice. But Sergeant Nathaniel Dre had one more stop to make before facing the cameras. In a small classroom at St. Margaret's Primary School, 7 children now 8 years old were waiting to welcome home their hero, not because he could walk, but because he had never stopped standing for what was right. As his wheelchair moved down the school corridor, past drawings and posters celebrating courage and kindness, Dre reflected on the day's events. He had entered that courtroom as a witness in a simple robbery case. He was leaving as something more a symbol of the truth that heroism isn't defined by what happens to you, but by how you respond to what happens to you. Marcus Whitley received a sentence of 15 years, with the possibility of parole in 8. More importantly, he began the long process of rehabilitation, inspired by the example of a man who had turned his greatest loss into his greatest strength. The case would be studied in law schools for decades to come, not for its legal precedents, but for its demonstration of justice as a living, breathing principle rather than a mere procedural exercise. And in a classroom filled with children's laughter, a man in a wheelchair sat surrounded by 8-year-olds who understood that the truest form of standing up has nothing to do with legs and everything to do with heart. The story of Sergeant Nathaniel Dre became a reminder that heroes are not defined by their limitations, but by their willingness to transcend them in service of others. In a world that often confuses strength with invulnerability, his example showed that real strength comes from the courage to continue serving even when service costs everything you thought you needed to succeed. He had stood in that courtroom, not with his legs, but with his spirit, and in doing so, he had lifted everyone around him to stand a little taller as well.